Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This is part 4 of our lunch hour series. I re recorded this one, so it probably sounds a little bit different. I wanted to change just a little bit because today we're going to be diving into some more advanced topics. We're going to be thinking about a different way of making patterns. As always, if this is the first episode you've seen, please go back to episode 1. The rest of this video is going to make no sense. But for the rest of you, hopefully you've gone through the episodes. We are now on episode 4. But guess what? You've already made a procedural generator at this point. That's basically what you were doing yesterday. You added a bunch of patterns in. You began to think about replacing words with lists of words. You began to think about how Tracery can pull things at random, which is really cool. Now, today we're going to be thinking about a different way of designing patterns from the top down rather than the bottom up. And it's going to get you thinking about a different approach to procedural writing, which I think is going to be really cool. And it's really important to note that what we are doing is really complex, and we're doing it in our lunch hour this week. So if this is the first time you're doing this, you're doing a great job. And, some of this is going to be tricky to understand or think about, but the more you do it, the easier it gets. And the more you talk to people about it and see how they do it, the more you understand how these things work. But one thing that I did want to add here on day 4, which is that if you're enjoying this and you want to read more, one of the best things ever written about this practice, which I've put here, is called grammar design. And I should really introduce that word, but that this is what we call these systems that we're writing in Tracery. We call them replacement grammars sometimes. And a really great example of the use of these tools is in something called the Annals of the Peregrines, which is a huge generated piece of text by Emily Short. It was made for the National Novel Generating Competition. And it's a travel guide that is written in part using replacement grammars. And at the end of it, Emily writes a really fascinating appendix about how she wrote these systems, her personal creative relationship with them, lots of philosophy about it. It's just an exceptional piece of reading. So I highly recommend reading the appendix of the Annals if you're enjoying this stuff this week. Anyway, let's move on to today's topic. So far we've looked at patterns, and we've looked at replacing words with lists of words, and hopefully you got comfortable writing patterns yesterday and turning a single word into a list of variations and then getting Tracery to replace them at random. And the way that we did this is that we looked at examples we'd already written by hand, and then we picked a word that we thought we could turn into a category. So we look at the word cheddar in this sentence, and we think, oh, well, that's a type of cheese, so I could replace it with a pattern, and then I could write lots of cheeses into that pattern, and then it will replace one at random. And similarly, we can look at captain, and we can say, oh, that's someone's title. So I could replace that with a list of titles. And we do the same for the surname as well. So we can call this a bottom-up approach, where we're starting at the lowest possible level of detail. We're starting at individual words, and then we're slowly replacing them to build something more complex as we go. And this approach is, perfectly fine. It's a really good approach for certain things, especially when you're trying to add these kind of fine-grained details. But in this case, we've got Captain Bumble as someone's name, and because we're just replacing the word captain with like a title, and we're just replacing the word Bumble with a surname, that's only capturing part of what's going on in this template. Really, Captain Bumble is just like an interesting name of a character, so we don't necessarily need it to have a title at the start. It could have something else. But to get there, we need to think about this process in a different way. So what I want you to do today is to go back to your original examples and look for high-level structures. We want to look not for individual words, but for collections of words which together represent a more general pattern. So to give you some examples, here are my example cheeses that I wrote back on Tuesday. And you can see that there's one pattern here where there's someone's name, kind of like we saw in the previous example. So Uncle Dup and Reverend Maud are different constructions of names, but they both refer to people. So name is clearly a particular theme that I've got in these examples. I've also got kind of descriptions of cheeses. Obviously, all of these are descriptions of cheeses to some degree, but specifically I've got kind of a type of cheese and then some kind of modifier to it. So that's really good to note down. Like mature and sharp are like real modifiers. Honking is not an official cheese modifier, but I've added it in. And I've also got some which are more kind of evocative. So I've got some kind of strange adjective like stinky or big. And then a name that we might not normally associate with cheese, like Edgar or Crimson. And this creates a more kind of, it doesn't look like something that necessarily describes cheese if we just showed this to someone on the street. But if you know that you're looking at the name of a cheese, it can be very evocative. So this is a particular template as well. And I've also got places. I've got real places like Dorset, but I've also got places which are less specific, like Cloudy Peak, that are clearly describing a place, but in a more poetic way. So what we're doing here is we're not thinking about individual words. Instead, we're thinking about the concepts that collections of words are describing. So, in a couple of cases, I've got a name like Uncle Dups, and then a cheese like Honking Blue or Sharp Cheddar. And so these are two kind of bigger concepts rather than individual words. They're chunkier concepts that I can see are connected together. And so what I can do from this is I can start writing patterns based on these concepts. I don't need to think about individual words. I can just think, well, look, I've got these patterns here where it's like someone's name and then a possessive and then a description of a cheese. And so a name here is very, very general. It doesn't have to be a job title and then a surname. It could be lots of things. And so I can now start thinking, well, if I wanted some interesting names, what shapes would these names take? And we could write examples, or we could just, again, think in terms of categories, think in terms of patterns. So it could be a title and a surname. It could be a job and a surname. It could be an adjective and a first name, like Stinky Edgar. And so now suddenly I'm thinking about different ways of expressing this high-level concept of someone's name, and I've gone down to like a slightly lower level of detail. And what's actually important about tracery is that we can have patterns that are just consisting of other patterns. So I can literally add a pattern into tracery that looks like this. I can say, look, there's a pattern called name, and there are 3 things a name can be, and all of these things are just combinations of other patterns. And the best part of working in this way is I haven't even written any of these patterns yet. What I'm doing is I'm thinking to myself, well, I want to write patterns for this thing and this thing and this thing. I want to have a surname pattern. I want to have a job pattern. And here you need to get a bit careful in naming your patterns because title is a little bit vague. I might forget exactly what that means, so I can add in some more descriptive pattern names. But the point is I'm going through this and I'm writing these patterns without knowing necessarily what the final output is going to be like. And then once I've written this name pattern, then I can figure out all of the patterns inside it that I haven't defined yet, and I can go and say, okay, well, a job could be a reverend or a doctor or a captain, etc. And so eventually all of the patterns end up in terms of fixed words, as in, not other patterns, but final words that can be put into a sentence. But we started from this very high-level concept. We started from this very general concept, and we worked down in detail. And we can do the same for cheese. We can think about like different ways of describing a cheese in this way and then write patterns for those too. So this is kind of what I want you to do today. What I want you to do is load everything in that you had yesterday. Hopefully you saved it and make sure that it works. And now what I want you to do is add a few patterns to your origin. And I want you to start using patterns that maybe that you haven't written yet. Or thinking about these higher level concepts. Maybe you've already got some that you can combine together into higher level concepts. So you might look at the things you've already written, or you might write new things for your origin. But either way, I want you to think about these more general terms. Look at your examples and think, what are the higher level concepts I've got here? What are the more complicated patterns I could define? And then break those patterns down into smaller lists. And you might find that the lower level lists you've already written yesterday, or you might find that it requires a new set of words, in which case you can write those. And if you do it one at a time and don't get overwhelmed, spend 20 minutes adding 1 or 2 new patterns in this way and see how you feel. See how the difference feels from how we worked yesterday, where it was more about individual words, and see how you find that. Pause the video here, and when we get back, I'll just walk you through a couple more advanced kind of interesting topics before we finish for the day. All right, welcome back. I just wanted, before we wrapped up, to go through a couple of more complicated things. That's because after this video, we've only got one video left, and that video is all about getting the bot online and celebrating being done. So this is kind of our last chance to get technical with it this week. So one thing that you might have noticed while working on these patterns is that some examples are more memorable than others. So in my list of place names, I might put something like Hobbiton, a place that doesn't really exist, and that might stand out as something special. So this can be good or it can be bad. Sometimes we might find that these rare or unusual cases come out too often, and so they lose their comedic power because people are seeing them too much. Or sometimes they might be too rare and people might not realize that there are these surprises in there at all, and they might get bored. So we can affect how frequently they come out by changing the lengths of these lists. So if I have a list of 100 place names, then each one has a 1% chance of appearing. But if I have a list of 10 place names, then each one has a 10% chance of appearing. So we can add words to our lists or remove them in order to change how frequent they are. But we can also cheat if we want to as well, and we can duplicate words. So in the bottom right, you can see I've actually only got 2 words in this pattern called taste. It can either be cheesy or it can be fruity. But I want cheese to mostly be cheesy, so I've just copied and pasted the word cheesy several times, so it's now much more likely to appear than the word fruity. And this is nice because it makes fruity very rare and unusual to appear in the outputs, but it also means that actually there aren't any variations here, so people may not even realize that this word is random until one day it gets replaced with fruity. So we can play around with probabilities to affect how memorable certain outputs are or how commonly they're encountered. I also wanted to introduce a couple of really nice tricks that Tracery has to fix some problems that you might have encountered while writing. So one problem that you might come across is deciding to disambiguate between a and an. So in this example on the right here, I have got the adjective animal example from yesterday. But I've added an adjective that starts with an A. And so now it reads a adorable rabbit, which is not grammatically correct in English. So we can fix this very easily in Tracery by using a special tag that it has. So you can see in this example here, I'm calling the adjective pattern. I've got adjective wrapped around with hashes, and it does the problem of a adorable, as I mentioned. If we put .a at the end of our pattern, so you can see here in the second example, I've got hash, adjective, .a, and then a hash. Tracery will automatically insert the correct word, either a or an, before the output of that pattern. So what this means is that instead of writing a and then the pattern name, you can see I've deleted that and I've just put .a after the pattern. And Tracery is clever. It knows that we're asking for the pattern called adjective. It won't look for a pattern called adjective.a. So everything after the dot is ignored when it goes to look up the pattern. But when it brings the result of that pattern back, it will look at the first letter, decide whether it's a vowel or a consonant, and then insert a or an appropriately. So a similar problem that we can have also is deciding whether or not a word should be capitalized or not in our lists. So for example, if I had a pattern that was someone asking animal or animal question mark, then we don't know whether animals should have a capital letter or not in that list. If I put them with lowercase letters, then the first word is incorrect. If I put them with capital letters at the start, then the second word in that pattern is incorrect. So whichever way round I do it, it's not going to work. Again, Tracery has a nice solution for this. We can tell it to capitalize the result of a pattern by putting .capitalize after the pattern name. So you can see in this example in the bottom, I have written animal.capitalize or animal. And that means the first one is always capitalized and the second one is not. And this means I can write all of my patterns in lowercase and then simply capitalize the ones that I want in my templates. Now, if you're struggling with this for the bot, or if this just sounds like a lot of work, don't worry about it. Like, this is just a bot we're putting together quickly this week. It doesn't have to be perfect. But if you've been interested in these problems or you haven't been sure how to solve them, this is a little tip for you. So if you've got a little bit of extra time today before we finish off, I was going to suggest finding one way to misuse a pattern. So if you've got something like, a list of cheese names, why not insert them into part of your name generator? So you get Dr. Tangy's special cheddar instead of things like Dr. Cook's. So find a way to misuse one of your patterns, and then maybe thinking about inserting some rare examples into the patterns you already have. These might be rare because they are kind of tonally different, like they might be funny in a serious generator, or they might be rare because they're very memorable or complex. Whatever reason, try and throw in some surprising ones for people. And finally, don't forget to save your work. We'll need it tomorrow when we launch our bot. All right, the long one today. Thanks so much for sticking with me. Well done for getting this far, and I will see you tomorrow for the final part of our generator series. See you then.